Okay, so let me put this thing away here and get out me pointer. Um, it looks like the pointer might already be there. Ooh, laser pointer. All right. So what we're going to be looking at right now is the war with Spain, which is rapidly approaching. Now, maybe it's just because of the effect of the time that we live in. I mean, you guys obviously are growing up in a very different world than I did. Now I'm sounding like that, back in my day guy. But when we think of conflicts, we're thinking about like, I don't know, China or some random terrorist group in the Middle East or, maybe even still Russia. It never really jumps into our head that Spain, and quite frankly, there's really no reason Spain should jump into your head. But as we kind of go back and look, going into the 20th century, there is a lot of tension with Spain, and it involves this Cuba. Now, for those of you who are not aware, or maybe have forgotten, Cuba is only 90 miles away from Florida. So, to put that in perspective, Cuba is actually closer to the United States than we are currently to Chicago. And I think that it's kind of natural when you look at it in that aspect to realize that the United States has at least a passing interest in, what's going on in something that close to us, especially when that something is in the possession of a foreign country. Cuba had been one of Spain's early North American colonies, and it was one of the last areas that they held on to. They still had a lot of Caribbean islands with all the other things that were going on. But Cuba was a valuable part of the Spanish Empire. And in fact, it's one of like the main, if not the main, revenue source for the Spanish Empire. Spain, by the 1870s and 1880s, is the last European country to still have legalized slavery. And the Cuban slaves were not happy being enslaved. And so, beginning in 1869, not unlike, cicadas, there's like every 5 to 7 years, there's a Cuban revolt that occurs. In 1869, the first Cuban revolt occurs. This may be kind of surprising, maybe not, but Americans, for the most part, were largely sympathetic towards the Cubans, and they wanted to support Cuba. This includes Southerners, which may be kind of surprising. Now, on the northern part, I think it's probably understandable that we had just fought a civil war to end slavery. So, okay, we can see why we should support the end of slavery in Cuba. The Southern support really has more to do with the fact that Southerners recognize the fact that America became an independent country by revolting against a European power, and they look at Cuba kind of the same way. Officially, the United States is neutral in the conflict. We don't take sides officially as a government, but it's important to understand here that American citizens are strongly in favor of the Cuban revolutionaries. The revolution is put down, but 6 years later, there's another revolution going on in 1875. Now, this is where America's problems with Spain really begin to develop much more distinctly. There's an American ship, a private ship named the Virginius, that was captured by the Spanish Navy in the Caribbean. And on board, the Spanish sailors found weapons, money, supplies going to the Cuban revolutionaries. The Spanish were not too happy about this. They declared that what was going on was an act of piracy, and according to international law, they were given the ability to render judgment on the pirates, and they executed every American on board the ship. That, by the way, is an act of war. What resulted, however, was Ulysses S. Grant, the president at the time, deciding to negotiate with Spain rather than going to war. And this really angered a lot of Americans. They were very, very upset that they could not, or that we were letting Spain get away with this. The reality of it is that Grant's decision to negotiate, which ended up getting the families of the American citizens who had been killed, something like about the equivalent of $10,000 American as payouts. The reality of this is that in 1875, Grant looked at the state of the U.S. Navy and realized that Spain would kick our butt if we attempted to go to war with them. So rather than have the humiliation of losing to Spain, which we would have done, we would have lost to Spain, he decided to go the humiliation of a diplomatic route and save American lives. What I want you to take out of that, though, is that realize that's 1875, a year before the Philadelphia World Expo. Grant begins the realization that America is not prepared to deal with a foreign threat. It's the next year with Krupp's big guns that signals to many other Americans, as well as the War Department as a whole, that America is not capable of dealing with a foreign threat. Part of the problem with this is the way that the Spanish see Cuba. For the Spanish, Cuba is not a colonial possession. It is a unique cultural part of Spain. It's sort of like they see Cuba almost to the same degree that we would view a state, that it's literally a part of their country, and it anything done to Cuba by anybody is actually a formalized declaration of war. And this puts a lot of pressure on the United States. It's also the situation where the Spanish are growing more and more uncomfortable with the situation in Cuba because of America's growing business interest. Cuba was the largest producer of sugar in the Western Hemisphere, and the United States began investing enormous amounts of money into Cuba. We were leasing out or buying land in Cuba and putting up sugar plantations. We were hiring out the Cuban slaves to work on these plantations, paying the Spanish the money to lease the land, money to essentially rent the slaves, paying a small wage to the slaves themselves, and paying to import the sugar. In fact, the United States imported more sugar from Cuba than Spain did. The result of this is the American business interests in Cuba pointing out to the Cuban people that if they were somehow to get free of Spain, all the money that America is spending would go to them rather than the Spanish. So this makes it, I think, a little bit more clear why this whole belief about Cuba and being a unique part of Spain makes the Spanish so uncomfortable. Because with what we're talking about, that's kind of the same formula that the U.S. went about in the acquisition of Hawaii. If you remember, Sanford Dole and some plantation owners overthrew the government of Hawaii ostensibly because there was a threat by the Queen of Hawaii to stop American sugar business. And by the 1870s and 1880s, Europe and America had developed quite the appetite for sugar. This actually comes to the point when Americans are strongly suggesting to the Cubans that if they can free themselves from Spain, they'll get more cash, that private Americans set up bases in Florida to secretly bring in Cubans, train them, arm them, equip them, and supply them, and send them back to Cuba to actually revolt. Americans began selling Cuban war bonds. They were selling certificates to raise money to um, fund a revolution against Spain. So it should be pretty obvious here why the Spanish are distrustful of America. So much so, this is a Spanish political cartoon from the time. Okay. And you will see here that it shows the fraternal concern of Uncle Sam and his creepy Slender Man like arms going out to grab Cuba. And he's just guarding the island of Cuba. That's all. The reality of it is that the Spanish are very much afraid, and probably not without reason, that the United States is actually desirous of acquiring Cuba um, for its own economic interests. Now, this leads itself, and we kind of have to take a sidetrack into the modernization of the Navy. So, there are three things that really drive home the need to have a modern Navy. The first that we've already talked about, if we go chronologically, is the Virginia incident, where Grant realizes that we can't fight against Spain. The second, which is the first one that we talked about as a whole this year, was the 1876 World Expo with the Krupp gun display. The third is a book written by an American naval officer, Alfred Thayer Mahan, Alfred T. Mahan. His book was a historical analysis of the development of commercial nations throughout world history. And he looked at things like the Greek city states, the great Roman Empire, the Italian Renaissance um, republics, and even China and England. And his conclusion was is that all of these commercial empires had great navies that allowed commerce to go unrestrained and free. Therefore, if America wants to be a great nation, it also needs a great navy. So these three things, Krupp's guns, the Virginius incident, and the realization that we can't take on a modern country, and Mahan's book, are all the things that lead the United States War Department to modernize the Navy. Now, remember, that is a process that takes place over 5 presidential administrations, nearly 2 decades, costing tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. So, what did all this bring us? Let's take a brief look, shall we, at the evolution of America's Navy. So, in the early 1880s, this is the pride and joy of America's Navy, the USS Independence. Uh, Somebody pointed out that it looks like a meatloaf or maybe a tin of banana bread. What this amazing thing is, if you can get a good look at this, it's a wooden ship that they simply put metal plates on. It's got a steam stack on it, so it's got steam power, but it's still got sails. Um, and it's still got the old Pirates of the Caribbean style cannons on it. This was like the U.S. battleship in the early 1880s. We move up from there to the USS Atlanta, which is a cruiser. The idea of a cruiser is an armored ship with bigger guns and armor plate, and it goes faster, hence the name cruiser. Now notice it's got steam power, but there's some things, and it's also got, there's a big gun up there, and it's got some guns down here on the sides. But there's a couple of other things to keep in mind about this. If you'll notice, it also has rigging on sails because the U.S. wasn't sure about the availability of coal to refuel the ship and the reliability of the steam engines. So while it's more impressive than the meatloaf boat, it's still got its flaws. Then there's the USS Dolphin, a naval dispatch vessel. If you look real hard on this, what you may notice is, or maybe not notice, aside from the fact that it's a small boat, it's really got no guns. Oh, way, way up here, if you squint real hard, it's got one of those hand crank Gatling guns. Um, I don't know what part of the word warship didn't quite fit. Oh, wait a minute. The word war in warship apparently didn't make sense to put guns on a warship. The USS Dolphin, ladies and gentlemen. And somehow or another, if an answer to that, you have the USS Vesuvius. Those are guns, and those are big guns. They are, in fact, the answer to Krupp's big guns. The Vesuvius is a very unusual ship in that it's of a ship, so it's part of the Navy, that was designed by the U.S. Army. And it's officially classified as a dynamite ship. So what that means is that if you follow these tubes down to the bottom, there are large, like doors or openings at the bottom that you jam dynamite into, and you load projectiles through the top, and then you launch the projectiles by lighting the dynamite underneath the deck and blowing them out of these tubes. Now, a couple of things about this. Number one, you will notice that the entire deck of the ship is wood, and you have dynamite underneath it. I'm going to let that sink in and let you process that. The other thing is that unlike even on the cruiser, which you can see here, this turret is mobile. It turns. There are no turrets on this. You literally have to turn the whole boat to shoot. Not maybe necessarily the best thought out idea. And the product of, loads and millions of dollars and decades of innovation, the pride and joy by the late 1880s of the United States Navy, the USS Maine, a modern battleship. Notice guns, big guns, turrets, metal, not much rigging, good-ish. So let me show you a different view. This is a model of the USS Maine. You will notice here that the main gun turrets, this is the back, the front has a similar one up here, are located off the sides of the boat. This idea actually had come from British shipbuilders, and the British Navy, by the way, rejected the design. The problem is that when you turned the guns to shoot, the recoil from the guns would actually tilt the boat over. Now, making matters even worse is if something was directly behind or in front of you and attempted to shoot at it, there was the very distinct possibility that you would actually blow part of your own ship apart. This is why the British rejected the idea. The United States built two of these magnificent vessels at the cost of millions of dollars. The reason that only two of them got built was because there was a disagreement when people found out that the first battleship was built based on a British design. They were angry that we hadn't hired Americans to design the ship. So an American company designed the ship, which was essentially the same thing, just, basically reversed. And they built two of them. When Grover Cleveland got in for his second term, he basically face-palmed and is like, this is just stupid. And the U.S. built smaller, more efficient ships that were at least doable. For America, our Navy was modern, technically, as it was steel, but it was still not nearly up to snuff compared to the European countries. Brazil in the 1880s still had the largest navy in the Western Hemisphere. By the 1890s, at the Chicago World's Fair, after the Chicago World's Fair, the U.S. had caught up with Brazil, but we were still inferior to most European navies. The key there is most European navies. Okay, we'll pick this up later. So we have the background to why the Navy was updated and the problems with Cuba. We'll hop into the rest of it later. Peace and love.